in the last couple of sessions we have primarily focused on kind of psychological aspects of behavior, impact of early childhood experiences and impact of abuse, neglect, the fact that behaviors logically make sense. We kind of talked about that. Today, we're going to completely switch course. We're going to switch course and we are going to look at, really kind of some of the biochemical nature, body, mind connections. Have you ever asked yourself how somebody like me from a medium-sized human service agency in Massachusetts got connected to NextJump? Very unlikely connection, right? There's corporate America, and here we are, we are running farms, we're having people with disabilities, and the connection piece was actually Charlie and Megan found me based on the article at the Rolling Stone magazine about, Luke's best chance, about a reporter who was planning for his son with autism, what he was going to do when he was 22. And they found me. Out of the blue, I'm getting this email saying, you are so much like us. We really want to come. We want to learn with you. We want to learn from you. And a little while later, here were Charlie and Megan on one of our farms, actually two of our farms in very cold, wintry Massachusetts. And we're talking. So what do we have in common? And what we had in common was that we believe, that NextJump believes that really takes an integrative, kind of approach to help people be the best they can be, to be the best performers they can be, to be the best workers they can be, to have a balance, right? And we believe the same thing. If you look at, well-being in general, and if you look at our culture, we are a culture of quick fixes. We are a culture that pigeonholes approaches to well-being. So, in current America, 1 in 2 people are taking prescription drugs. 75% of all Americans are taking over-the-counter medication regularly. And in 2016, 40 million Americans took psychiatric medication. It was headed up by depressants, then it came to sedatives, then it came to antipsychotics, and then it came to stimulants. So why is there such a culture of medication and quick fixes? Don't get me wrong, there's a place for medication, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but why are we such a culture of kind of medication, that medication treats life experiences we had, that medication is responsible for our happiness, that medication is responsible for our ability to focus and hold attention? Why do we look at that? Part of course is a culture that, it's a pharmaceutical culture that really looks at, kind of selling sick. The other piece is that, we really kind of, again, have this pigeonhole approach to services, when we really should look at kind of a more integrated approach. So we need to look at, just like NextJump, things such as, nutrition, and such as sleep, and such as, all these different kinds of things play a huge role. Research has shown, and that's going to be a lot of what we're talking about today, is that the lines between psychological and, physiological are really blurring, that we're seeing an impact of experiences in brain chemistry, for example, and that we see in how experiences can change our brain chemistry, our whole being. So the idea, just by taking medication, we will be able, for example, to fix something, doesn't make any sense. It really requires an integrative, kind of approach. So what we've started to at our agency is we have started to say, we're going to stop saying we want to fix things. We are going to say, how can we set up every single person who we work with and who works with us, it goes for employees as well, for success. So the central question of our working with people with disabilities or people with mental illness or supporting our employees is really, how do we set everybody up for success? It is not about compliance. It is not about anything else. It is just, that is the central question to everything that we do. So, for example, now I need my first slide. I'm trying something different this time. I'm going to put some slides up just because there's a lot of material, and I think it might be easier for some of you who might be visual learners to go through slides. The next slide. Okay. There it is. So everybody knows Maslow's kind of hierarchy of needs, right? And when we look at the hierarchy of needs, some of us might have it in psych class or in business class. We kind of do away with it and say, okay, I know what the hierarchy of needs are. But the hierarchy of needs is really something that is important every single day in every single environment. It doesn't mean it doesn't matter if you're a social worker or if you work for NextJump. The needs, our hierarchy of needs are always the same. So if we want to set up people, whether or not it is our children, our significant other, our coworkers, our supervisees, or people with significant challenges up for success, we must make sure that the hierarchy of needs is met. And if you look at the first two pieces in particular, not that I have anything against love, but the first two segments are really important. The physiological needs and the safety needs. That is really the foundation of any other processes. That is also the foundation of our ability to learn, our ability to restore, relax, our ability to keep our body and brain in balance. Because balance is really what we're looking for. Our body seeks balance. So if you look at the developmental pyramid, and by the way, you can have all these handouts if you like them. There's a way for us to get to them after the presentation is over. So if you look at the developmental pyramid, again, it is physiological and biomedical balance and sensory processes and reflexes. If you look at traditional kind of way, how we conduct therapy, it starts at the cognitive. It doesn't start at the bottom. It starts at the cognitive and perceptual. When really the foundation for any cognition and perception is the bottom piece. So we need to employ a bottom-up approach. If you have somebody you're supervising and you're hoping for that person to change or perform better, whatever, we often start again with the cognitive perceptual. We don't necessarily say, hey, are you getting enough sleep? You have nutrition, you eat good food, those kinds of things. But it's the very, very foundation that makes other things possible. The other thing about the developmental pyramid, of course, is a developmental pyramid that was meant for children. But if you really think about it, it applies to all of us every day. So every day we're going through the steps of, kind of the developmental pyramid. I don't know if you remember last time, for example, we talked about, for those of you who are not there, we talked about children in timeout, right? And the children, have to sit still and think about what they have done if they're misbehaving. That is a cognitive and perceptual process. Many kids, rather than timeout, need something that's sensory and need gross motor. They do much better if they can jump and get their energy out, right? So up and down on the developmental pyramid, it is not only for child development, it is really for all of us every day, the foundation how we've been set up for success. So what we've done is we have developed this kind of approach. It's a holistic approach. And again, we use that with the children and adults we support, but we also use the same thing with our employees. And you'll find many parallels between NextJump in the business world and us as a human service organization. We have, probably a little bit more on a little bit more on behavior things and other stuff, but for the most part, it's very, very similar. So for example, if somebody is depressed because they're lonely and they feel alienated and I give them an antidepressant, that is not going to solve the problem of loneliness. I also, at the same time, have to make sure that I support that person in establishing social connections and supports, or in supporting that person to develop the skills that it takes to develop social connections and supports. If, for example, somebody is stressed out, and we're going to talk a lot about stress today because it's a very, very interesting subject. If somebody is stressed out, it is not enough to just say, practice 10 minutes of yoga and mindfulness, because it does not address the kind of underlying causes of stress that are not always cognitive. They're often biomedical, or they're sensory, or they're medical. For example, if you break a leg, it is as stressful as a divorce. So there are different kinds of stressors that we usually dismiss, but we have to address things simultaneously. If we have sleep difficulty, we cannot restore, we cannot, produce enough chemicals, positive brain chemicals that allow us to be refreshed for the next day. So all these kinds of things, or sensory. Again, I said that sensory is kind of one of those interesting things. In my opinion, most people in this world should have a sensory evaluation. Most of you probably did not, but it says a lot about, about environments that make us comfortable. So sensory, for example, and we're going to talk about that more probably next session, is really to create an environment that allows us to function our best. One of the first trainings I had mentioned that I'm sitting in an office that right now is full of PPE because we're in human services, we're still collecting PPE, but my office is also fire engine vet. Most of you might not feel comfortable working in a fire engine vet office. To me, it is fantastic. I've got clutter all over the place. I've got pictures. My whole office is chaos. My desk is chaos. And I work really well in that way. Or, you know, when kids, for example, say, please let me do my homework while I'm listening to music and at the same time watch TV and write a letter to my friend, right? And you say, but honey, you can't concentrate. Many kids can concentrate best when they do exactly that, right? So sensory is kind of what kind of environment sets us up for most success. Sensory is also, you know, for example, if we preoccupied with our kind of sensory system, it causes stress and it causes discomfort that prevents us from being successful. For example, if you've ever sitting in a train and two trains next to each other, one train moves, the other one doesn't. And for a moment, you have this pit in your stomach, say, oh my God, is it me moving or is it the other train, right? And it's uncomfortable because you don't know if you're moving or not. Kids with sensory issues, they have this feeling all the time. They're so preoccupied with kind of, am I moving, where am I in space, can I feel something, that they cannot focus on learning or they cannot focus on, you know, performing really well. So that's why we talk about the holistic approach to things. We're going to talk a lot about nutrition, but that is how we kind of look at, you know, really an integrated kind of a support to everything we do, not only for people we work with. And again, social connections are really, really important. We say something really quick about social connections. Social connections here is defined. We don't have to have close friends, but we have to have regular kind of social contact, positive social contact with others. In order to socially survive in childhood, kids do not have to be popular. They do not. Actually, being popular is really hard. So kids have to have, however, one good friend who is greeting them when they're coming off the bus or they can eat lunch with, so they're not eating lunch alone. That is enough to socially survive. So this idea that we have to have a ton of friends or, you know, that we have to be socially positive, you know, popular, doesn't apply. But all that, the balance of all these kinds of things creates an integrative approach. The idea that, you know, for example, a therapy session for 45 minutes can fix somebody who is had a life experience of alienation and anger and, you know, and really complex problems and feels isolated, doesn't make any sense, because those kinds of things are so complex and go through really all parts of our being. So the integrated approach is a really important piece. The integrated approach is also important because, my next slide, next slide isn't coming. So I'm going to talk about the next slide. So, oh, there it is. So the next slide shows us the symptoms of mental health disorders, nutrition depletion, and stress. And if you look at them, they're exactly the same, right? I mean, I'm asking that question rhetorically because Christine from Cheyenne, I can see you. That's good. And Gilda, I see you too. So that's like, right? So if you look at them, they're exactly the same. And everything is so much more interconnected. So that's why we really have to figure out, even, you know, when we address things and when we plan for setting people up for success, like these are the symptoms that look the same. So most likely, also, if somebody has a mental health disorder, they're stressed. So we need to address stress. If somebody does not get good nutritious food, and most of us get enough macronutrients, but the micronutrients that are really responsible for brain chemistry and behavior, we don't get enough of, right? Or as we're going to talk about, stress shuts off energy to the gut. Well, the gut, of course, is really important and producing important things like dopamine, right? So 95% of dopamine, which is responsible for our mood, for happiness, for those kinds of things, comes from the gut, doesn't come from the brain. So if stress interferes with our gut of, you know, production of happy messengers, then we are much more likely to, you know, to experience all these kinds of things. So it's all kind of interconnected. So when we talk about stress, and that's going to be our first piece, our first kind of button we want to focus on today is stress. We talk about stress. So there are very different kinds of stress. There's good stress, you know, like it's an acute stress. It's somebody's stressed like me, for example. I'm stressed because I have to do presentation, you know, in front of a screen for Next Jump. And, you know, that's kind of a little bit stressful. And you're not my usual audience. You're not all social workers and, you know, or childcare workers or support staff. So that stresses me out a little bit. But so it's acute stress, right? But it goes away. Once this is over, I'm going to go ride my horse and I'm going to relax and say, okay, life is good now, right? So then you have something that's called eurostress. And eurostress is actually euphoric stress. So that's the kind of stress that we feel when we ride a roller coaster or when we fall in love, right? Remember when you fell in love, it's very stressful. You know, it's a very stressful thing, but it's still something that makes you happy and euphoric. This Eurostress really has a function to kind of create a balanced life of excitement, and it's a good stress. Acute stress also, by the way, sometimes helps us to perform better. So there's a good part to stress. Given again that I've got ADD, I do really well under stress. I'm procrastinating. That's part of ADD, as you know. And, you know, so for me, stress is something that motivates me quite significantly. So when I started very, very recently preparing for this training, like yesterday, I did start preparing yesterday, which is pretty good for me. You know, that's kind of, I can put out a lot of, you know, volume of stuff in a fairly short period of time. So that's what stress does really well. Then there is kind of periodic stress. And periodic stress is starting to be a little bit more unhealthy. Periodic stress, for example, is when you're in a relationship that's not great, right? Have like ongoing issues of domestic violence, or you have ongoing money problems. So the periodic stress really kind of puts you at risk of engaging in coping behaviors that are not healthy, like overeating or drinking, or, you know, just those kinds of things that are not healthy. But they're not yet to the level of chronic stress. And chronic stress is very, very toxic. And the stuff of, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about, just looking at my slides now. We'll talk a little bit. So chronic stress is really what is pretty significant. And chronic stress is something that actually will change and can change our brain structure and our brain chemistry. Now, chronic stress is something that's interesting, is often, the origins are often in childhood. And remember last time we talked about childhood, right? That childhood experiences are really profound in you know, in kind of shaping who we are, how we deal with challenges. And we talked about the impact of particular childhood abuse and neglect experiences prior to being really significant. That also goes for stress. When we think about stress, we often do not think about like children in stress. Children experience really significant amount of stress, right? You know, kids in life is stressful. So for example, many times when kids go to school, they come home from school and parents say, well, sit down and do your homework. That's not good, because they need to de-stress. There needs to be some time for them to come home and de-stress and regenerate, right? Kids are under enormous amount of pressure and stress, particularly right now. So, you know, we also think about stress also only as something that is, you know, based on experiences. But stress, here's my signal, stress is also other things. So stress can be biological, anything that's going on with our, you know, biological system. So for example, for those of you who are not there, menopause is awful. The amount of stress menopause puts on your body is terrible. It is just not a good thing. It's tremendous. And it's a long period of time because it's not over in a week or two, right? So menopause, for example, would be an enormous biological stress. Environmental, so, you know, toxins that we have in the air, any kind of, you know, high temperature, low temperature, anything that's environmental. Emotional, we have talked about the deprivation. And deprivation is something, again, that we don't often associate with stress. But think about how many children are deprived of good food, right? We're going to talk, again, a lot more about food. Food is almost a class issue. While we are able to feed kids enough calorie and the macronutrients, we often are not able, or many people are not able to feed kids stuff that contains the micronutrients, because that is often food that is much more expensive. And that is a deprivation. And food and nutritional imbalances, as we have seen in the first slide, have a huge effect on a child's well-being, development, ability to learn. So that is a very, very common stressor. I don't know if you saw the news this morning, but when the news came on this morning, it said, based on the coronavirus crisis right now, 1 in 5 children do not get enough to eat. That is a huge stressor. And that effects of that is going to be lasting for a long time. So, you know, when we think about, again, the deprivation, it's not only the deprivation of food, but of particularly nutritious food, right? If you go to McDonald's and you want to buy a burger, you can get one. Actually, maybe right now you cannot buy a burger because there's a beef shortage. But before coronavirus, you can go and you can get a burger for 99 cents, right? But if you go now, if you go and buy a salad, all of a sudden it's $4, right? So it really is becoming, and it's becoming a class issue. Good nutritional and nutrition food deprivation becomes a class issue. But we're going to talk about that more. Family issues. So those are some of the things that are common stressors. Nutritional imbalances, bacteria, viruses, parasites, mold is huge. And again, we find mold, for example, and allergens more in living situations that are poor, right? But those are kind of, stressors. Environmental stressors, noise, extreme temperature. So I don't know about you, I don't like the cold. So I think that, for example, I get stressed out when it's cold, and everybody has a different kind of relationship to, to environmental stressors. Sensory sensitivities are huge. If you have ever seen a child with autism being auditory defensive and screaming and clapping their ears, it's basically to shut everybody else out. So I think, again, those are some of the things that we not think about as stressors, but are huge. They are huge, right? Or, I don't know about you, but if you wear uncomfortable clothes, like something that, tags that scratch in the back, right? Have you ever had that? I mean, it's one of those rhetoric questions, you can answer me. But if you have tags that really bother you, or you have scratchy clothes, right? You get really preoccupied with, that scratches, that's uncomfortable. You can't focus as well just because you're uncomfortable, right? Or if your clothes are too tight or they're too loose, or, everybody has those kinds of things. They are stressors, right? And the tag thing, I think, is a pretty good analogy because it's such a small thing, can really just, be a big thing. Lack of sunlight. I don't know about you, again, it's another rhetorical question, but I certainly have seasonal affective disorder. And it's kind of funny because the part of Germany where I was from, it was 50 degrees all year long and it was cloudy and it rained. That was it. So I should really kind of be more familiar with it, but lack of sunlight is huge. Vitamin D is really responsible for many part for happiness, alertness, those kinds of things. That's why people who have vitamin D deficiencies often struggle with kind of mood, right? So lack of sunlight, overscheduled. Right now, nobody is overscheduled. However, most often, all of us are. If you think about the roller coaster outside of the coronavirus of activities we engage in and we put our kids through, it's huge because it does not allow room and time for recovery. And that's another huge big thing. And I learned that from Charlie and Megan, and we have very much integrated that into everything we do, is recovery. Because we think about recovery as athletes. Athletes have to recover their bodies. So we think about people who are substance abusers and they have to recover. But recovery is really important to all of us, that we allow ourselves, our children, our coworkers, recovery time from a stressful event. How many times have you been going from one meeting to another, phone call to phone call? All this time, there's no recovery. There's not a moment where you can catch up, right? If you think about how we all going to have to recover and grieve about coronavirus, it's going to take us a long time. It is not going to be over just because it's over. We will have to recover also on our emotional and biomedical kind of front because it has done a number on most of us. So the time for recovery is really important. It's the same thing with kids, right? When kids are misbehaving and we say to them, let's talk about it, right? We talk about it often in the sense like, what could you have done differently? What have you learned from this? We are not talking about how can we help you move on from this experience? How can we help you recover? For example, if you ever thrown a temper tantrum, right? It is hard work. If you throw a temper tantrum, that's really tough. You need to recover from your temper tantrum, because it's hard work. So, for example, when we have people on the spectrum and they have a temper tantrum, they have throw computers and they throw tables and, they really can sometimes become quite agitated. Not everybody does, by the way, but some people do. That is such hard work that the first thing I will say to them is, I am sorry that life is so hard for you. Would you like to have a snack? And then let's clean up together. But it's that kind of recovery piece, the acknowledgement that this is hard. Nobody wants to behave badly, right? It's a recovery piece. We do the same thing with our employees. If our employees have performance issues, we make sure that we allow for room and mechanisms for people to recover, right? If people had a really tough experience. In our world, sometimes that means that, somebody, might get kicked, right? I mean, so we allow for people to say, take a walk, take an hour, recover. And what it really does is it increases the productivity of everybody. And it sets up us as up for success, for much better being able to deal with the next kind of challenge that come along. So recovery is really a huge, big thing. And crowding, right? I mean, right now we don't have a problem with crowding, but usually if things are really kind of crowded and tight, it becomes tough. I traveled to India and I really loved India, but it was very crowded, you know, and it was kind of, the crowding was challenging for me. So factors that make stress more harmful. Again, the earlier in childhood stress has been experienced, the harder it is. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. That's one of the big factors that makes stress more harmful. If stress is unpredictable, if we don't know that's coming, like if I knew that I was teaching this class today, I knew it was coming. It is, again, the acute stress that I'll get over. It helps me probably even perform a little bit better. But if Charlie would, you know, Charlie at one point, like 2 years ago, he came and there was this big auditorium and they're waiting for a speaker. And he came to me and says, Danielle, you have to speak. I was like, I have to do what now? He says, you have to speak because she's late and you have to go up on stage and you have to talk in front of people. I said, well, that's not my audience. Those are business people in the military, and I wasn't prepared. That was a stressful event. Does that make sense? If something is more unpredictable, there's no time limit to stress. Think about it, you know, you can get through things once you know it's over, right? When we have licensing in our agency, you know, the state comes in, they look at our file, it's very stressful, but then it's over. Coronavirus has no time limit. It is very stressful. And the lack of support. So that's another huge big thing. When we look at childhood and children experiencing stress, the children that have the support of a caregiver, a teacher, doing that kind of whatever the event is, will become more resilient. The children who will not, who do not have that support, will become much more sensitized to stress. Does that make sense? Again, one really important question. Thank you, Christine, for nodding. I think that's really good. All right, so the next slide is, there was a fantastic article in Psychology Today. If you ever, we have it, if you're interested in it, it was an amazing article about stress. And it, you know, basically the author said that we are becoming sensitized to stress. And, you know, becoming sensitized to stress because it's almost views as stress as like an allergy, right? It is kind of, stress is a psychological equivalent of ragweed. Over the time the body becomes sensitized to pollen or ragweed, it takes only the slightest bloom in the spring or fall to set up biochemical alarms, right? I never had any allergies. I'm like going to be 58 this year, and like 2 years ago, all of a sudden I got allergies. Like, what's up with that, right? But we may not think we are getting worked up over running late for an appointment, but our brain is treating it as though our life is on the line. So this is something that I think is absolutely fascinating in the sense that, you know, the way the stress that we are, you know, exposed to, particularly again in early childhood, and that's where everything comes together, often determines the way we are responding to stress later on in life and our ability to handle stress later on in life. There's a study done with monkeys, and, you know, there were monkeys, and the first group of monkeys kind of bonded with their mother, no problem. The next group of monkeys, they were removed from their mothers, for baby monkeys, for 15 minutes at a time. What the brain chemistry and research showed is that those monkeys who were removed 15 minutes had a muted stress response. So a little bit they responded less, they had an inhibited stress response. And then there was a group of monkeys that was removed for 3 hours, and they were hypersensitized and hyperreactive to stress. Because the first group of monkeys, it was a stressful event. They inhibited that response a bit in order to get through it, but there was a time end to it. The 3 hours was traumatic. Being removed for 3 hours was traumatic. So that group of monkey was overreactive, and they could not, for example, distinguish between a predator and a non-predator. So when they had like other animals in the room, they were not a risk to them, they were still reacting as, you know, that other animal was a risk to their lives, right? So remember we talked about last time, for those of you who were there, about reactive attachment stuff, right? That the way we bond, you know, is really kind of established early in childhood. And people who are not having that bond will develop reactive attachment issues. So the interesting thing is that, you know, really the brain chemistry is, you know, is in kids who've experienced this amount of stress, or monkeys who experience this amount of stress, is actually corroborating the psychological kind of event. And that is, what's kind of exciting about this kind of development is really that, the lines between psychological and physiological are getting to be much closer. So and a couple of other things. So, in general, if you're hypersensitized to stress, and again, you have to think about that we have to include children in that as well, or coworkers, our work environment, right? If you're hypersensitized to stress, our body is constantly on fight and flight. We are releasing chemicals, body chemicals, to seemingly small events that we would usually only release if we would have a life or death kind of emergency. That is kind of the, the sensitized response to things. So, the example in psychological today was really great. If we are treating running late for a meeting like, life or death situation, and our brains and bodies fire off, right, chemicals and flooding our bodies with that kind of chemical, that is really, an interesting thing, because it's basically creates a slow and toxic environment for our body. And if you think about the things that stress us out, right? Deadlines stress us out. Or I was commuting to Boston, I live an hour north of Boston, and I was commuting to Boston every day. I hated it. I would never go back to that. I pumped gas before I went to Boston. But every day I was stressed out. And every day the stress was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it was almost like unbearable just driving in to Boston. And to me, it was almost really like this fight or flight thing, right? Coupled with the anxiety of my supervisor saying I couldn't be late. So that's kind of stuff. So it really kind of wears us down. So let me just see if I can get anything. So, okay. So trauma in general, it also has very long-lasting effects. So particular, not only in children, but any kind of pretty significant trauma effect has, trauma experience has an effect not only for our, ability to function and perform, but also long-lasting effect on our health. So there was a study that was done with veterans, so World War II veterans, that half of them were imprisoned and the other half were not imprisoned. And it showed that all the veterans that were imprisoned had an 8 times higher risk of stroke, even years and years after their imprisonment, than the veterans who did not. So we're really looking at kind of long-term effects. And if you think about, stress goes on our cardiovascular system. It's not a secret that people are stressed out are much higher, much more likely to have heart attacks and to have strokes and those kinds of long-term issues, right? So the other thing is that, that our sensitization to stress also means that we're getting stressed out, that our brain is rewired to have a stress response when there's actually not even anything to be stressed out about. So for example, we're seeing dangers and getting stressed out about an imagined danger that's really not there. Or we see a hot stove and we see a small child, the stove is off, but you still think, oh my God, she's gonna get burnt, and you have a tendency to just wanna put a hand away from the stove, right? The stove is off. That is kind of the sensitization to stress, that we respond really, that we hyper-reactive and we unleash amount of body chemicals. So if you look at, the way how our stress system works, the hypothalamus is kind of an area that's as big as a grape. It's located in the brain, and they are connected to the close by pituitary glands, and then a little bit further adrenal glands. So the hypothalamus communicates with the pituitary glands about the release of 2 different kinds of chemicals. One is an inhibitory, and one is an exciting stimulant, hormones. So we have 2 kinds of hormones that are being released, again, the exciting one and the inhibiting one. Most of the time, when people have experienced stress, or when they're experiencing stress, they release the excited one, right? So we have it kind of in that altered state. That then is, there's also been a hormone that's been released it's carried to the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands are really kind of what runs our stress response system. So the adrenal glands is kind of the grandma, grandpa of kind of our fight and flight, right? Our fight and flight. So this is just, I'm going to skip over that a little bit. These are just a list of different neurotransmitters. Again, we're just going to skip over that because we're running out of time. And the next one. So we're going to stop right there. So there are different kinds of, neurotransmitters that are, that are being released. So for example, I call it adrenaline, it's easier for me. There's adrenaline that's being released, there's cortisol that's being released, and those are all kind of chemicals that are responding to our stress response, But they also, the kind of what they call the stress management axis is also in charge of modulating many other body functions. So the stress system together, we're talking about the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenaline gland. They're also regulating heart rate, they're regulating temperature, they're regulating most of our automated kind of systems, right? So what that does is when they go into constant stress response, it kind of, dysregulates our entire system. It makes our blood pressure higher. It kind of, for example, in order to preserve energy, the brain shuts off, energy to the gut because they need it in the brain. And with that, our digestive system is significantly affected. Remember I said earlier that dopamine is made in the gut. So if you're constantly stressed out, the likelihood of the gut being able to, break down and metabolize nutrients that allow us to, utilize, dopamine, which we really need for mood and happiness, to slowing down our reactiveness, is really high. So that's where this is all kind of interconnected. Cortisol, for example, has a profound impact on short-term memory. So it is found that they actually, it's found that, like a little bit behind with my slides here, I'm going to go one more. Cortisol is made in the adrenal glands, and that's kind of well known as a stress hormone. But an excess level of cortisol, for example, attacks the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the area that is responsible for our short-term memory. So excess level of cortisol makes the hippocampus shrink. Remember we said last time the connection between psychological, that kids often who are traumatized forget their suppressed memories, they forget what their kind of traumatic events, right? So they forget it as a defense mechanism. But here's again the connection to our brain chemistry, which is they also forget it because the hippocampus is not working. There was a study where they looked at 38 women who were sexually abused. 20 of them, not 38 women, they looked at 38 women, 20 of them were sexually abused, 18 were not. They found that in all cases of the women who've experienced sexual abuse, their hippocampus was smaller. They did MRIs, and in every single case, the hippocampus was smaller. That is pretty fascinating because, again, it shows a correlation between again, experiences, psychological and physiological. If you look at MRIs of, people with PTSD, they also have a smaller hippocampus, so which makes sense because if stress gives us a smaller hippocampus, then people with PTSD do too. But what they also have is they have a really significant decrease in the frontal cortex, which of course is responsible for our kind of, our, regulation system, our thought, our higher functioning system, and they have an increase in a much bigger amygdala. And that's the other piece, like when people always say like, use it or lose it, right? If you don't lose your brain plasticity, right, you're going to lose it. So the interesting thing is like our brain chemistry and our brain functions can change, the structure of our brains changes in the way we're using it, right? If we are all the time on the peripheral and we're using the amygdala, which is responsible for emotional responses all the time, it's almost like exercise, it's almost like a muscle that we develop, and that is becoming stronger and stronger versus, sorry, garbage truck is coming. So it's stronger and stronger versus kind of other parts of our brain that we're not using as much. All right, so this is kind of just a slide kind of for those of you who do better with, with kind of graphics of, the stress response system, how that works. Fight or flight, again, there's a lot of physiological stuff that's going on that really kind of gets us ready for fight and flight. Blood pressure increases, we have faster, deeper breathing, the heart rate increases, increased blood flow to brain. I mean, all these different kinds of things. And so stress alters our brain. Chronic stress is poison. That's really what it is. So, the next one. So again, we have talked a little bit about, chronic stress on the brain, how it changes the brain structure, but chronic stress also gets us to more stick with our habits. Like, when we want to diet, when we want to change ourselves, when we want to increase somebody's performance, right? And it's really hard. The more you're stressed, the more you'll be likely to go back to the habits because that's something that's familiar with, and there's no other room to do other things. So what do we do? What do we do about stress, right? How do we address stress? And again, as I said in the beginning, it is much more complicated than just saying we're going to be mindful, we're going to relax, we do yoga. This is something that actually treats, the issue related to stress or the symptom of stress, but not the underlying causes. So in order to address stress, the first thing we have to do is we have to figure out how we can get our physiological kind of components into a kind of balance. So for example, there is specific nutrition, and that was actually, it's going to be the topic of our next discussion. You can eat certain things that will help neurotransmitters. So if you want to increase, for example, your dopamine levels, you can eat, pineapple and walnuts and certain things. So there's specific nutrition, because again, nutrition works both ways, right? We can have nutrition, deficits, but we can also, address certain issues with nutrition. That is the very first thing. Of course, there are things like exercise, right? And some people don't like exercise, but exercise, for example, increase our kind of dopamine and our, the runner's high. Dopamine, by the way, is really interesting too, because brain chemistry is so sensitive, right? For those of you who drink, if you drink at night, whenever you drink, most likely your blood pressure will go up, because dopamine is responsible for elevated blood pressure, and even a slight increase in dopamine will increase your blood pressure. And that's, for example, where you have the heart connection and the cardiovascular, connection. And that's where you also have, because dopamine is kind of looking for rewards, the connection, the physiological connection between dopamine and addiction. So it is all really, really, really close related. And I think as time goes on, the physiological and the psychological we find are going to be even more closely related. And we cannot just treat one aspect of things. We have to really treat and look at the whole person. Other thing, it's like, for example, sleep hygiene. So, serotonin, for example, is regulating our sleep, among other hormones. So it's important that, we make sure that, again, in our holistic approach, that we practice really good sleep hygiene, because that is also, responsible for restoring and for finding balance, because it really is all about balance. And I will stop right here because last time I ran over.
Thank you so much, Daniela. This is really fascinating. I'm so excited for next week. I hope I get to moderate again.
Thank you. So next week, we're going to talk about nutrition as a next piece, how we can really use target nutrition in order to kind of improve our balance, our well-being. Not just organic food and staying away from processed food. It's more complicated than that.
Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you.